May 29, 1946. Bikini Atoll. The sun hung low over the Pacific, painting the lagoon in shades of copper and violet. The water was impossibly still, a mirror reflecting the silhouettes of nearly 100 vessels anchored in tight formation. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, ships that had carried men through typhoons and torpedo runs, through the hell of Leyte Gulf and the frozen waters off the Aleutians. Now they sat silent, empty, waiting. On the decks of some, mannequins dressed in naval uniforms stood at attention, frozen sentinels facing an enemy they could not see. Below decks, instruments measured radiation levels, blast pressure, thermal output. Goats and pigs, crated and restrained, shifted nervously in compartments that still smelled of diesel and sweat. The men who had sailed these ships were gone. The war was over. But the vessels themselves had one final mission. In the control room aboard the USS Appalachian, anchored safely beyond the reef, technicians monitored countdown clocks and radio frequencies. Admirals and scientists stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by instrument panels. Outside, camera crews adjusted lenses on equipment designed to capture images at speeds the human eye could not follow. Journalists from 17 nations crowded onto observation ships, notebooks ready, trying to find words for something that had never been described before. At precisely 0900 hours, a B-29 superfortress named Dave's Dream released a single object over the lagoon. It tumbled through the tropical air, a cylinder of plutonium and high explosives with the codename Gilda, painted with the likeness of Rita Hayworth. For 43 seconds, it fell. Then the world turned white. The blast arrived not as sound but as pressure, a fist of superheated air that flattened the ocean itself, creating a dome of displaced water half a mile wide. The shockwave tore across the lagoon at the speed of sound, stripping paint from hulls, collapsing superstructures, vaporizing radio masts. The mushroom cloud rose with terrible beauty, boiling upward into the stratosphere, carrying with it millions of gallons of seawater turned to radioactive mist. When the roar finally reached the observation ships, 11 miles distant, it was the sound of God slamming a door. This was Operation Crossroads. The first of 23 nuclear tests America would conduct in the Marshall Islands over the next 12 years. But it was more than a weapons test. It was a funeral, a reckoning, a statement written in fire and radiation about what would happen to the ships, and the ideas, of the old world. Because in the silence after the bomb, as the mushroom cloud drifted westward and the first casualties began to sink beneath the contaminated waves, a question hung in the air that no admiral wanted to answer. What do you do with 1,000 ships built for a war that no longer exists? The men who built the American war machine expected glory. They got bureaucracy. By the summer of 1945, the United States Navy was the largest maritime force in human history. Nearly 1,200 major warships, 64,000 landing craft, 100,000 auxiliary vessels, 6 million men and women in uniform. A fleet that could darken the horizon from one end to the other, that could deliver an invasion force to any coastline on Earth. The factories that built them, shipyards in Philadelphia, Norfolk, San Francisco, Seattle, had operated around the clock for 4 years, turning out carriers and destroyers with assembly line efficiency. Welders worked 3 shifts in all weather. Riveting guns hammered through the night. By 1944, American shipyards were launching a new escort carrier every week, a new Liberty ship every day. And then, in August 1945, the war ended. Not with a whimper, but with 2 atomic blasts that rendered obsolete every battleship, every doctrine, every assumption about how wars would be fought. The factories went quiet. The workers went home. And the Navy found itself in possession of the largest collection of suddenly useless military hardware in history. The Germans had known something about this. In June 1919, at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, the Imperial German Navy scuttled 74 warships rather than surrender them to the British. Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, watching his fleet sink beneath the cold Scottish water, believed he was preserving honor. The British called it vandalism. The sunken wrecks remained on the sea floor for decades, monuments to pride and obsolescence, but America in 1945 faced a different calculus. The ships were not symbols of defeat but of overwhelming victory, yet keeping them was impossible. The cost of maintaining even a fraction of the fleet, fuel, maintenance, crew salaries, would bankrupt the Navy's peacetime budget within a year. And beyond the financial burden was a more fundamental problem. These ships, built to fight the last war, were already anachronisms in the shadow of the atomic AGE.SO. The decisions began. Quiet, bureaucratic, irreversible. The newest ships, the carriers and cruisers commissioned after 1943, were retained and modernized. Radar systems were upgraded. Flight decks were reinforced for jet aircraft. Nuclear propulsion was studied, then slowly implemented. These vessels would form the backbone of the post-war Navy, a force designed not to win battles but to prevent them, to project power through mere presence. The rest, the hundreds of destroyers, the Liberty ships, the landing craft that had stormed Normandy and Okinawa, were declared surplus. Some were sold to Allied nations. Britain took cruisers to replace ships lost in the Atlantic. France acquired destroyers for its Mediterranean fleet. Nationalist China received landing ships for operations against the communists. But most nations were exhausted, broke, uninterested in American hand-me-downs.so. The ships were gathered, towed to anchorages in quiet bays and river estuaries. The James River Reserve Fleet in Virginia, Sassoon Bay in California, Puget Sound in Washington. They were moored in long rows, side by side, grouped by class and size. Their guns were shrouded in canvas. Their engines were drained and sealed. Their compartments were filled with dehumidifiers and vapor phase inhibitors, chemicals meant to slow the inevitable decay. The sailors called them ghost fleets. From the air, they looked like graveyards. Hundreds of gray hulls stretching to the horizon, their wake lines etched into the muddy water. On foggy mornings, they seemed to float in clouds, phantom vessels suspended between memory and oblivion. Maintenance crews visited quarterly, checking for rust, pumping out bilges, ensuring that the ships remained theoretically ready for reactivation. But everyone knew the truth. These ships would never sail again. They were waiting not for orders but for a decision. What the admirals expected was pragmatism, perhaps scrapping, perhaps preservation, perhaps conversion to merchant use. What they could not have imagined, what none of them wanted to confront, was that America's atomic scientists needed targets. Living targets. Ships that could be bombed, measured, dissected, studied. Ships that could teach lessons about what nuclear weapons did to steel and flesh. This was how Operation Crossroads was born. Not from strategy but from scientific curiosity married to political theater. The world needed to see what the bomb could do, not to cities but to the instruments of war themselves. And America, possessing both the weapons and the surplus vessels, was uniquely positioned to provide that demonstration. The sailors who had served on those ships felt betrayed. They felt rage. They felt grief. When the target list for Bikini Atoll was published, veterans groups erupted in protest. Among the 95 vessels selected for destruction were icons of American naval history. The USS Nevada, a battleship that had survived Pearl Harbor, steamed out of the burning harbor under her own power while bombs fell around her. The USS Saratoga, a carrier that had fought in every major Pacific campaign from Wake Island to Iwo Jima. The USS Arkansas, a battleship launched in 1912, that had provided fire support for the D-Day landings at Normandy. The USS Nagato, the Japanese battleship from which Admiral Yamamoto had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, was captured intact at Yokosuka.to. The scientists, these were test subjects. To the sailors, they were comrades. Letters poured into Congress. Veterans demanded that the Nevada be preserved as a museum, that the Saratoga be converted to a training carrier, that the Nagato be scrapped rather than honored with a warrior's death by atomic fire. The Navy responded with clinical efficiency. These ships were obsolete. Maintaining them served no strategic purpose. Their sacrifice would provide invaluable data on nuclear weapons effects, data that could save thousands of lives in future conflicts. What the Navy did not say, what could not be said publicly, was that the decision had already been made. The target fleet had been assembled. The test schedule had been set. 23 nuclear devices would be detonated over the next 12 years, and the ships were merely the first subjects in a long experiment. An experiment to determine whether aircraft carriers could survive atomic attack, whether submarines could operate in irradiated water, whether naval warfare itself had any future in the nuclear age. On March 7, 1946, the target vessels began arriving at Bikini. They came from every ocean, every theater. German cruisers captured in European waters. Japanese submarines raised from the Pacific floor. American destroyers that had hunted U-boats in the Atlantic. They were moored in precise geometric patterns, arranged by size and distance from ground zero, each position calculated to measure specific blast effects. Scientists installed thousands of instruments, pressure gauges, radiation detectors, temperature sensors, strain meters. They loaded the ships with fuel and ammunition to simulate combat conditions. They welded steel plates to decks to measure fragmentation patterns. They placed test animals, goats, pigs, rats, mice, throughout the vessels, dosing them with radiation protective compounds to measure efficacy. the Bikini Islanders, relocated by military order, watched from distant atolls as their home became a laboratory. The first test, Able, was the airstrike. The bomb missed its target by 700 yards but still sank 5 ships instantly and contaminated dozens more. The second test, Baker, was an underwater detonation. The device was suspended beneath the landing ship LSM-60 and triggered at 90 feet depth. The explosion created a column of water 6,000 feet high and 2 million tons in weight. It generated waves that hurled warships onto their sides. It turned the lagoon into radioactive soup, so contaminated that support crews refused to board the surviving vessels. Sailors in protective gear scrubbed decks with brushes and lye, but the radiation persisted. Dosimeters clicked frantically. Men developed burns, nausea, and hair loss. The third test, Charlie, was cancelled. The fleet was too contaminated to approach the target ships that survived. Hulls cracked, superstructures collapsed, systems fused by electromagnetic pulse were towed to open ocean and scuttled. Among them was the Saratoga, sinking slowly off Bikini with her flight deck awash, planes still chained to her catapults. The Nevada, toughest battleship in the fleet, the only capital ship to survive both Pearl Harbor and both atomic blasts at Bikini, was towed to Hawaiian waters in 1948 and used for gunnery practice. She absorbed fire from cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft for 4 days before finally sinking, defiant to the end. The sailors who learned of these deaths, and that is what they were, deaths, did not speak of strategy or science. They spoke of waste, of disrespect, of the feeling that something sacred had been violated, that the ships which had carried them through fire deserved better than to die as laboratory specimens. But the tests continued. Eniwetok Atoll, Johnston Island, Nevada test site. Over the next 4 decades, America would detonate more than 1,000 nuclear weapons, many of them using surplus World War II equipment as targets. Tanks, aircraft, bunkers, and always ships. Because ships could be anchored precisely, could be loaded with instruments, could provide data on blast effects and fallout patterns that no simulation could match, the symbolic weight of this was not lost on America's former enemies. In Tokyo and Berlin, in cities still choked with rubble, the images from Bikini Atoll appeared in newspapers and newsreels. The mushroom clouds. The capsized battleships. The American scientists in white coats, clipboards in hand, measuring the destruction with clinical detachment. To the Japanese, it was proof of something they had suspected since Hiroshima, that American abundance was so complete, so overwhelming, that they could destroy their own fleet for the sake of experiment. The Imperial Navy had fought to the last ship, had sent boys in suicide planes against American carriers, had believed that sacrifice and will could overcome material advantage. And here was America, incinerating dozens of warships not in battle but in peacetime, simply to gather data. It was not cruelty. It was something worse. It was indifference. The indifference of a nation so wealthy, so secure, that it could afford to obliterate tools that other countries would have treasured. The Germans understood differently. They saw in the atomic tests not just military power but ideological statements. The Nazis had built their war machine on mythologies of blood and steel, on the belief that will and racial purity could triumph over industrial capacity. They had been crushed by that capacity, by the endless American production that turned out tanks and planes and ships faster than they could be destroyed. Now, in the post-war silence, America was demonstrating that the industrial age itself was over. That ships, factories, mass production, all the tools that had won World War II, were obsolete in the face of atomic weapons. The Soviet Union drew its own conclusions. Stalin ordered crash programs to develop atomic weapons and nuclear-powered vessels. The Soviet Navy, which had played a minimal role in World War II, became a strategic priority. If surface fleets were obsolete, then submarines, quiet, hidden, nuclear-armed, would be the decisive weapon. The Cold War arms race, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the ICBM and the ballistic missile submarine, all can trace their origins to those moments at Bikini Atoll when American scientists demonstrated that the era of the battleship had ended. But for the men who had served on those ships, the symbolism was more personal. Aboard the observation ships, veterans watched through dark goggles as vessels they had lived on, fought on, bled on, vanished in atomic fire. Some wept, some turned away, others stood rigid, faces set, refusing to show emotion. One sailor, interviewed years later, described the feeling as watching a friend be executed. Not killed in battle, not lost at sea, but deliberately destroyed by the very nation that had built them. The recurring symbol, The object that appears again and again in memoirs and oral histories from this period, is the commissioning plaque. Every U.S. Navy ship has one, a bronze plate listing the vessel's name, hull number, launch date, and sponsor. When ships were decommissioned, these plaques were supposed to be removed and sent to the Navy archives or presented to museums. But in the chaos of post-war demobilization, many were overlooked. Sailors who visited the ghost fleets in the late 1940s reported finding plaques still mounted in empty wardrooms, in passages choked with cobwebs, in compartments slowly filling with seawater. Some veterans, realizing that the ships were destined for destruction, went aboard and removed the plaques themselves. Technically this was theft of government property, but the Navy did not prosecute. The plaques ended up in living rooms, workshops, and VFW hulls. Small pieces of bronze carrying the names of ships that no longer existed, that had been vaporized at Bikini or scuttled in deep ocean trenches or sold for scrap metal that became bicycles and refrigerators. These plaques were relics, not of war, but of a particular moment when America possessed such overwhelming power that it could afford to destroy its own fleet, and such confidence in the future that it believed new weapons would make the old ones unnecessary. They were right, and they were wrong. The ships that survived Bikini, that were not sunk by the blasts or scuttled due to contamination, faced slower deaths. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the reserve fleets in Sassoon Bay and the James River were gradually reduced. Some vessels were recalled to service during the Korean War, hastily recommissioned and sent to bombard North Korean positions. A few made it to Vietnam, where World War II-era destroyers provided gunfire support for amphibious operations. But most simply rusted. The process was bureaucratic and glacial. A ship would be evaluated, found obsolete, and placed on the disposal list. Bids would be solicited from scrap dealers. The highest bidder would receive title to the vessel and a deadline to remove it from the anchorage. Cutting crews would arrive with torches and cranes, and over months, the ship would be disassembled, piece by piece. The steel would be melted down, purified, rolled into new shapes. Armor plate from battleships became structural beams for office buildings. Propeller shafts became industrial machinery. Aluminum from aircraft carriers became cookware. Nothing was wasted. This was the American way, pragmatic, efficient, unsentimental, but there were exceptions. Ships that carried too much history, or too much symbolism, to be casually scrapped. The USS Texas, battleship that had served in both World Wars, was saved by a veteran-led campaign and turned into a museum ship at San Jacinto. The USS North Carolina, preserved at Wilmington. The USS Massachusetts, at Fall River. The USS Iowa, eventually moored in Los Angeles. A handful of vessels, selected not for their strategic value but for their narrative power, their ability to tell a story that the public wanted to hear, but for every ship preserved, 100 were destroyed. And with them went knowledge that could not be recovered. Modern naval architects, studying World War II-era designs, have been stunned by the sophistication of construction techniques that are no longer used. Riveting patterns that distribute stress more effectively than welding. Hull forms optimized through empirical testing rather than computer simulation. Damage control systems designed by men who had experienced flooding and fire firsthand, rather than engineers working from abstract principles. When the last World War II destroyer was scrapped in the 1990s, it marked the end of an institutional memory. No one alive still knew how to design a ship to absorb torpedo damage without sinking, because no one designed ships expecting them to take torpedo hits. Modern warships, built around missile defense systems and electronic warfare, are faster, more lethal, and vastly more fragile than their World War II ancestors. A single anti-ship missile can mission kill a destroyer that cost $3 billion to build. The irony would not have been lost on the veterans. They had warned that scrapping the old fleet was short-sighted. Those wars had a way of not conforming to predictions. That sometimes the low-tech solution, 1,000 mass-produced destroyers, was more survivable than a dozen high-tech cruisers. But by the time they were proven right, the shipyards that built those destroyers had been demolished. The workers had retired or died. The industrial base had contracted. America, which had launched a warship every day in 1944, struggled to build one a year by 2000. The ships were gone. The capacity to replace them was gone. Only the radiation remained, embedded in the coral of Bikini Atoll, where even now, 80 years later, the background count is higher than anywhere else on Earth outside Chernobyl. There is a place in the Pacific, deep in the Marshalls, where the water is too clear and too warm and too empty. Bikini Atoll was declared safe for resettlement in 1969. The displaced islanders returned, replanted their coconut palms, and rebuilt their homes. Within a decade, they began developing cancers at abnormal rates. Thyroid tumors, Leukemia. Birth defects. The cesium-137 embedded in the soil had contaminated the food chain. In 1978, the island was evacuated again. It remains uninhabited, but the lagoon draws divers. Not many. The remoteness and the lingering radiation keep casual tourists away, but those who make the journey find something unique in the world. A graveyard of warships, preserved by the very contamination that killed them. The USS Saratoga lies in 180 feet of water, upright, largely intact. Her flight deck, once crowded with dive bombers and fighters, is now covered in coral. Sharks nest in her hangars. Tuna swims through her engine rooms. Divers report an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the occasional creak of metal settling deeper into the silt. The USS Arkansas, a battleship sunk by the Baker test, rests upside down in 170 feet, her hull cracked open by the force of the underwater blast. Her guns, blown from their turrets, lie scattered across the sea floor like fallen trees. The Japanese battleship Nagato, Yamamoto's flagship, sits in deep water beyond recreational diving limits. Her pagoda mast collapsed, her forward turrets buried in sediment. She sank slowly, over 5 days, finally succumbing on July 29, 1946. Observers reported that she went down bow first, her ensign still flying, as if in salute. These wrecks are monuments, though not the kind any nation wanted to build. They are monuments to the moment when warfare outgrew the instruments designed to conduct it. When victory became so absolute that the victors had no use for the tools that achieved it. When abundance, industrial, atomic, ideological, made waste not just possible but strategic. The American sailors who fought World War II understood scarcity. They rationed fuel, ammunition, and food. They repaired equipment that should have been replaced. They made do, improvised, adapted. Then they came home and watched as their nation, flush with post-war prosperity, threw away more material in a single year than most countries possessed in a decade. This was a shock. Not that America had won, but how casually it discarded the instruments of victory. The Soviet Union, struggling to feed its people while building a nuclear arsenal, saw that waste and called it decadence. The Marshall Plan recipients, rebuilding from rubble with American loans, called it generosity. The former Axis powers, occupied and disarmed, called it terror. The terror of knowing that America could afford to vaporize its own fleet simply to test a theory. But in the VFW halls and Legion posts, in the bars near naval bases where old men gathered to drink and remember, a different word was used, betrayal, because the ships, in the end, were not just steel. They were promises. Promises that service mattered, that sacrifice had meaning, that the tools which won freedom would be honored, not discarded. When those ships sank beneath atomic clouds or were cut apart in scrapyards, something else sank with them. The belief that America remembered, that it valued the price paid for its abundance. Today, the last of the ghost fleets are nearly gone. The ships moored in Sassoon Bay and the James River are down to a few dozen, the final remnants of a once vast reserve. Some are being slowly dismantled for scrap. Others have been designated for artificial reefs, to be cleaned of contaminants and sunk off coastal waters where they will become habitats for marine life. A few, too contaminated for any use, remain anchored in isolation, waiting for radiation levels to decay to safe levels, a process that will take centuries. The last battleship in the reserve fleet, the USS Iowa, was finally removed in 2012, preserved as a museum in Los Angeles. The last World War II-era carrier, the USS Hornet, is a museum in Alameda. The last submarine, the USS Bowfin, is preserved in Pearl Harbor. These museum ships receive thousands of visitors annually. Families walk their decks. School groups tour their compartments. Veterans, fewer each year, return to point out the berthing areas where they slept, the gun mounts they manned, the galley where they ate meals before battle, but the narrative presented is carefully curated. These were ships that won a great war. Ships that defended democracy. Ships that deserve honor. What is not discussed, what does not appear in the brochures or the audio tours, is what happened to the 1,000 other ships that served just as faithfully and were destroyed not by enemies but by decision. By the calculus that says obsolete tools must be discarded, that past victories do not guarantee future relevance, that sentiment is a luxury America could not afford in the Cold War, the veterans know. But they are dying. The last survivor of Pearl Harbor passed in 2023. Within a decade, there will be no one left who served on these ships, who felt their decks roll in heavy seas, who knew them as living things, and then the ships will be only what we make them. Symbols, stories, lessons about power and waste, about victory and obsolescence, about the cost of being so far ahead that you can afford to destroy the past. May 29, 1946. Bikini Atoll. The moment after the bomb, the mushroom cloud rises, boiling with colors that have no names. Below, the USS Saratoga lists to starboard, her flight deck awash, water pouring through rents in her hull. The USS Arkansas has simply vanished, vaporized by the underwater blast, leaving only bubbles and radiation. The USS Nagato, alone at the far edge of the target array, burns with chemical fires, her magazines cooking off, secondary explosions rippling through her superstructure. On the observation ships, scientists check their instruments and make notations. The blast yield was within predicted parameters. Radiation levels were higher than expected. Structural damage was extensive but not uniform. Valuable data. Important data. On those same ships, sailors stand silent, watching the smoke rise. They do not speak. They do not need to. They all understand. What has just happened? This is the funeral for a world that ended not in 1945 but now, in this moment, when the tools that won the war are declared insufficient for peace. There is a photograph from that day, grainy and overexposed, taken from the deck of the USS Appalachian. It shows the mushroom cloud at the moment of formation, the stem still connected to the lagoon, the top beginning its terrible bloom into the stratosphere. In the foreground, partially silhouetted, stands a sailor. His back is to the camera. His hands rest on the rail. His head is tilted upward, watching. No one knows his name. The caption lists him only as unidentified crew member. But in the archives of the National Museum of Nuclear Science, in the collection studied by historians and doctoral candidates, this image has a nickname. They call it the Last Sailor, because he stands at the edge of one era and looks into another. Behind him, the age of battleships and carriers, of steel and rivets and men standing to the guns. Ahead of him, the age of missiles and submarines, of deterrence and abstraction and wars fought by pressing buttons in climate-controlled bunkers that he does not move. He does not turn away. He watches as the fleet, his fleet, the ships that carried his generation through hell and brought them home, dies in fire. And in that stillness, in that moment of witness, there is something that the scientists with their instruments cannot measure, that the admirals with their strategic plans cannot account for, that the politicians with their speeches about the atomic age and the future of warfare cannot understand. There is grief. Not for the ships themselves, metal and paint cannot suffer, but for what they represented. The belief that there were limits to destruction. That tools built to defend freedom would be preserved, honored, remembered. That victory earned something more than the right to obliterate your own fleet in the pursuit of greater power. The sailor stands. The cloud rises. The photograph is taken, and somewhere, beneath the contaminated water of Bikini Lagoon, a bronze commissioning plaque settles into coral sand, its inscription still legible, stating facts that no longer matter, the name of a ship, the date it was launched, the promise that it would serve with honor. The radiation will keep that plaque preserved for 10,000 years, long after the steel has corroded, long after the battles are forgotten, long after anyone remembers what those ships died for. It will endure, like all monuments do. Not because of what it says, but because of what it cannot say. That abundance, unchecked, becomes waste. That power, absolute, becomes indifferent. That victory, total, creates new wars. This was the fate America chose for its fleet. Not preservation, not honor, not memory, just data, and silence. And the slow decay of radioactive steel beneath a tropical sun. The lesson was written in fire. But it was never learned.